Who is that woman? That's Mark O'Rourke's wife. I didn't know he had one. Those 3 sentences traveled across the ballroom of the Harrington Grand Hotel faster than any rumor Tara Shields had ever started. And Tara had started plenty. Tara Shields stood at the center of that glittering room the way she always did, like she owned it, or at least like she was certain no one would dare tell her otherwise. Her silver gown caught the chandelier light beautifully. Her laugh was perfectly pitched. Her hand rested on Mark O'Rourke's arm with the casual confidence of a woman who had convinced herself that possession and proximity were the same thing. She had been telling people for months, quietly, with a smile the way calculated women do, that Marco's wife was essentially a ghost. She doesn't come out, and she doesn't exist in his world anymore. Honestly, I'm not even sure why they're still technically married. And the people around her nodded, because Marco had never corrected the story. His silence, as it always had, spoke for her. If you love stories where the woman everyone underestimates walks into the room and changes everything, hit like and subscribe. Tara had met Mark O'Rourke 14 months earlier at a private investment summit held on the 42nd floor of the Caldwell Tower. She had noticed him immediately, not because of his looks, though the broad shoulders, the neck tattoos just visible above a crisp collar, and the way every person in the room subtly adjusted their posture when he walked in were impossible to ignore. She noticed him because of the space he occupied. Mark O'Rourke didn't fill a room. He compressed it. And everyone moved slightly closer to him or slightly away. There was no neutral. She introduced herself before anyone could introduce her. That was always her move. Mark O'Rourke was, depending on who you asked, either a highly successful property developer with a remarkable instinct for undervalued real estate, or the most quietly dangerous man in the city. Both descriptions were accurate. He had built a legitimate empire on top of an illegitimate one, and he ran both with the same cold precision. He was 43 years old, married, and, according to every public record, entirely devoted to his business. What no public record mentioned was Vivienne. Vivienne Rourke had been 26 years old when she met Marco at a private exhibition at the Caldwell Fashion Institute, where she worked as a junior curator. But she was the kind of beautiful that doesn't announce itself, the kind that takes a moment to fully register and then becomes impossible to forget. Dark hair, sharp and straight to her shoulders, eyes the color of deep water on a gray morning, a way of moving through a room that suggested she had somewhere important to be and was in absolutely no rush to get there. Marco had stood in front of a piece she had curated for 40 minutes before asking who was responsible for it. When she introduced herself, he looked at her the way people look at something they intend to acquire. They were married within 18 months. And then, slowly, quietly, with the gentleness of a tide pulling sand from a shore, Vivienne disappeared. It was not dramatic. Marco never raised his voice at her. He never issued ultimatums in anger. He simply explained, but with great patience and what she understood at the time to be love, that his world was dangerous, that visibility was vulnerability, that the best thing he could do to protect her was to keep her name out of every room he walked into. No public appearances, no career that could be used as leverage, no spotlight that could attract the wrong kind of attention. "I need you safe," he told her. "That means I need you private." Vivienne believed him. She loved him. She traded her curatorial career, her fashion world connections, her public identity, all of it, for a marriage to a man who kept her like a secret he was proud of, but unwilling to share. For 12 years, she was Mark O'Rourke's greatest asset and his best-kept one. She ran their household with quiet precision. She read voraciously. And she maintained correspondence with her closest friends, particularly Dina Walsh, a sharp-minded attorney who had been her college roommate and who had spent years gently, persistently reminding Vivienne that she was worth more than invisibility. She stayed. Because she had made a promise. Because she believed in the man beneath the power. Because she loved him, even when loving him felt like slowly becoming someone she no longer recognized in the mirror. She did not know about Tara Shields for 6 months. The information came not from a private investigator or a suspicious receipt, but from an unexpected source, one of Marco's own lieutenants. A man named Curtis Briggs, who had known Vivienne since the early years of the marriage, and who, unlike his employer, apparently, had not forgotten what loyalty looked like. He didn't send a letter. He sent a voice recording. It was from a private dinner at the Laurel Club 3 weeks prior. Tara's voice was bright and easy, mid-laugh, clearly performing for an audience. His wife, oh, she's been locked away so long I'm not even sure she remembers her own name. Marco keeps her like, what's the word, a placeholder. Something he needed once and just never got around to returning. Laughter around the table, and then silence where Marco's voice should have been. He said nothing. Vivienne sat in her kitchen and listened to the recording twice. She set her phone face down on the marble counter. She sat very still for a long time. Then she stood up, walked to the bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and then reached to the very back, past the modest dresses and the practical separates she had assembled across a decade of deliberate invisibility, and pulled out a garment bag she had not opened in 4 years. Inside it was a floor-length crimson sequined gown with a dramatic caped back, a clean neckline, and a thigh-high split. It had been a gift from Raymond Osei, her old mentor from the Fashion Institute, sent on the occasion of her 40th birthday, with a note that read simply, "For when you're ready." She unzipped the bag. She held the gown up in the light. She was ready. What followed was not fury. It was something far more dangerous, clarity. Vivienne called Dina Walsh that same evening. By the end of the call, a quiet legal process had already been set in motion. A careful documentation of the marital assets Vivienne was entitled to, handled entirely off Marco's radar. Dina was thorough. She was also furious on her friend's behalf, which made her even more thorough. Meanwhile, Tara Shields continued her campaign with increasing boldness. She began accompanying Marco to business events that had previously been strictly professional. She started dropping Vivienne's name in social conversations with the easy contempt of someone who believes their opponent has already conceded. She pressured Marco, gently, then less gently, to formalize what she considered already decided. Marco hesitated, not out of loyalty, not yet, but out of the particular unease of a powerful man who senses, without being able to articulate why, that something is shifting beneath his feet. The invitation to the annual Rourke Foundation Gala arrived at the house 3 weeks before the event. Vivienne's name was still listed as co-chair, a formality no one had bothered to remove because no one had expected her to use it. She RSVP'd. She did not tell Marco. The night of the gala, Tara Shields arrived at the Harrington Grand Hotel on Marco Rourke's arm, silver-gowned, champagne already in hand, entirely certain of her position. She had spent the afternoon at a salon. She had coordinated with the event photographer. She had whispered to 2 journalists that they might find the evening particularly newsworthy. She had prepared for every variable. She had not prepared for the doors to open at 9:14 p.m. and for every conversation in the room to stop. Vivienne Rourke walked in alone. The crimson gown moved with her like it had been designed for exactly this moment, because, in a sense, it had. Sequins caught the chandelier light and scattered it across the walls like something between fire and starlight. The dramatic cape swept behind her with each step. Her dark hair fell straight and precise to her shoulders. Her eyes, calm, certain, and utterly without apology. Swept the room once, the way a person surveys a space they have decided to occupy permanently. Diamond drop earrings, dark nails, the particular stillness of a woman who has stopped waiting for permission. She didn't hurry. She didn't smile for the crowd. She didn't need to. Mark O'Rourke, a man who had, on multiple occasions, received information that people intended to kill him without visibly reacting, went completely still. Tara Shields followed his gaze, her champagne glass tilted slightly in her hand, and the most beautiful woman in the room understood, in one devastating instant, that she wasn't. The ballroom of the Harrington Grand Hotel had a particular kind of light, the sort that costs money to replicate and flatters everyone inside it. Crystal chandeliers hung from gilded ceilings like frozen explosions of gold. The air carried champagne and expensive perfume and the low, practiced laughter of people who had learned long ago that being seen in the right room was almost as valuable as being right. Tara Shields understood this perfectly. She had built her entire life around it. She stood near the center of the room, never the edge, and never a corner, her silver gown catching the chandelier light in the way she had calculated it would when she'd chosen it 4 days earlier. She was animated, gesturing with her champagne flute, her laugh landing at exactly the right volume. Not too loud, just loud enough to be noticed by the people she needed to notice it. Mark O'Rourke stood beside her, broad and immovable in his black jacket, his white shirt open 1 button too many at the collar, the ink of his neck tattoos just visible above the fabric. He was not a man who performed comfort. He simply existed in spaces and allowed the spaces to adjust around him. Tara's friend Giselle had leaned in close, her voice low and conspiratorial beneath the music. She had asked the question the way people ask questions they already know the answers to. Not for information, but for the pleasure of having someone confirm the story. Is it true he's still technically married? Tara smiled. It was a particular smile, polished and faintly pitying, the kind designed to make the recipient feel they had just been invited into a confidence. Technically, she said. But honestly, Giselle, the woman hasn't been seen in public in 3 years. She's basically furniture. Beautiful furniture, maybe. Marco has taste, but furniture. She laughed softly. Giselle laughed. 2 other women nearby caught enough of it to smile along. Some women, Tara continued, dropping her voice just enough to make it feel like generosity, choose to disappear. You can't blame a man for eventually looking up. The small constellation of guests around her absorbed this with the comfortable nods of people who have already decided which version of a story they prefer. Marco said nothing. He lifted his drink. He looked toward the far end of the room. The grand doors were closed. At 9:14 p.m. they opened. But to understand what happened when those doors opened, you have to go back. 12 years back, to a woman who was not yet invisible, who was, in fact, one of the most quietly luminous people in any room she entered, though she would have been embarrassed to hear it said that way. Vivian Hartley was 26 years old and the most sought-after junior curator at the Caldwell Fashion Institute when Mark O'Rourke walked into the private exhibition she had spent 4 months building. That she was not supposed to be the story that evening. The exhibition was a retrospective on West African textile influence in 20th century European couture, which she had assembled with the meticulous devotion of someone who genuinely believed that fashion was a form of history, and that history deserved to be handled carefully. Marco stood in front of the centerpiece display, a reconstructed ceremonial fabric installation flanked by archival photographs, for 41 minutes. She knew because she had been watching him from across the room, initially because she was paid to watch how guests engaged with the work, and then for reasons she was too professional to fully acknowledge. He was not what she expected when he finally turned and asked who had curated the room. Because she had expected someone who asked that question to follow it with a business card and a pitch. Marco simply listened to her answer. Then he asked another question, then another. He had the particular quality of making conversation feel like the only thing happening in the world, as though the room full of people behind them had simply ceased to matter. They talked for 2 hours. She was careful. She had done her research on the guest list. She knew who Marco Rourke was. Or rather, she knew the polished surface version that appeared in business profiles and property supplements. The rest, the parts that people whispered about in certain circles and never committed to print, she had gathered in fragments. She was not naive. Not. And she was 26 and sharp and completely clear-eyed about the fact that this man operated in spaces where the light didn't always reach. And she said yes, anyway. 18 months later, in a quiet ceremony with 11 guests, she became Vivian Rourke, because the man she had fallen in love with was not the surface version and not the whispered version. He was something more complicated and more compelling than either. A man of genuine intelligence and unexpected tenderness, who read history for pleasure and remembered the details of conversations from months prior and looked at her, consistently and without performance, like she was the most interesting thing in any room they shared. She had loved him completely. That part was never the problem. The problem arrived gradually, at the way most serious problems do, not as an event, but as a series of small adjustments, each one reasonable in isolation, each one imperceptibly narrowing the space she was allowed to occupy. It began with security. Marco explained it patiently in the first months of their marriage that his position made her a target. This was not paranoia. It was demonstrably true, and she understood it. Anonymity was protection. A public profile was an invitation. She agreed to step back from the Institute. She agreed to decline the interview requests that came through her former colleagues. She agreed to remove herself from the guest lists of events where photographers would be present. She agreed and agreed and agreed because she loved him, and because each individual agreement seemed like a reasonable price for the life they were building together, and because Marco was always so calm and so certain when he explained the necessity of these things that questioning them felt like questioning his judgment about a world he understood far better than she did. What she did not see, could not see, from inside the process was the shape that all those small agreements were making together. A silhouette. A woman-shaped absence. The outline of someone who had been, feature by feature, consideration by consideration, quietly erased. She stopped attending public events. Then she stopped being mentioned in connection with the foundation that bore her husband's name, despite the hours she had contributed to its programming. Then her friendships narrowed, not by force, but by friction. But it becomes difficult to maintain a social life when you cannot explain why you cannot attend, why you prefer not to be photographed, why you live in a beautiful house that very few people are permitted to visit. One by one, the connections thinned. What remained was Dina Walsh, her college roommate, now a formidably competent attorney, who called every week without fail and asked direct questions and never once accepted vague answers as substitutes for real ones. And Raymond Ose, her mentor from the Institute, who sent her books and catalogs and the occasional pointed note, reminding her that great curatorial instincts did not expire. Everyone else she had lost to the slow erosion of a life lived almost entirely in private. She told herself in those early years that it was protection. Marco had said so, and Marco was not wrong. There were real threats. She had seen enough of his world from the edges to understand that visibility genuinely carried risk. Later, she told herself it was love, that this was what loving a complicated man required, not sacrifice exactly, but accommodation, a reshaping. All long marriages required some reshaping. Later still, she stopped telling herself anything at all. She read. She tended the garden she had developed an unexpected devotion to. She corresponded with Dina. She moved through her days with the quiet discipline of someone who has learned not to want things they cannot have. And she did not examine this too closely, because examining it would have required her to name it. And she was not quite ready to name it. She was 38 years old. She had been married for 12 years. And she had not attended a public event in 3. She was, by every measure that the world Tara Shields occupied would recognize, invisible. The voice message arrived on a Tuesday morning in October from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't listen to it. Unknown numbers had a policy in her life. She let them go to voicemail and deleted them unheard if they didn't identify themselves. But something made her press play. Perhaps instinct. Perhaps the particular quality of the silence at the beginning of the recording, half a second of ambient sound, cutlery, low music, the texture of a private dining room, that told her this was not a sales call. Then Tara Shields's voice, bright and unhurried and completely at ease. His wife? Oh, she's sweet from what I understand. Very quiet, very... A small, delighted laugh. Contained. Marco keeps her tucked away somewhere comfortable, like a retirement present he hasn't gotten around to opening. That sad little woman. Can you imagine spending your best years locked away, invisible, while... The recording continued. Vivian did not process all of it in the first pass. She was listening for something else. She was listening for the silence that followed, the space in the ambient noise where Marco's voice should have landed in her defense. A correction, a sharpened look, even an uncomfortable change of subject. Nothing. The conversation moved on. Tara laughed again. Someone else at the table made a comment she couldn't fully hear. Glasses clinked. Marco said nothing. Vivian set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. Aristide stood at the window and looked out at the garden. The late-season roses still holding their color. The light coming through the trees at the particular low angle of an October morning. She stood there for a long time, long enough that the light shifted. She was not crying. She noticed this with a kind of distant curiosity. She had expected somewhere beneath the stillness to find grief. She found something else instead. Something cooler and more precise. Something that had perhaps been waiting there for quite a long time, patient as a held breath, waiting for exactly this moment to be useful. She picked up her phone. She listened to the recording one more time, all the way through. Then she set it down again, walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway, and into the bedroom. She opened the wardrobe. At the very back, as behind 12 years of careful, modest, deliberately unspectacular clothing, the dresses chosen to blend, the colors chosen not to draw attention, the whole quiet wardrobe of a woman who had agreed to become background, hung a garment bag in ivory canvas, sealed with a brass zip she had not touched in 4 years. Raymond had sent it on her 40th birthday, with a handwritten note on his institute letterhead. I designed this for the version of you that hasn't gone anywhere. She's simply been waiting for the right occasion. I suspect she'll know it when it arrives. R. Inside was a floor-length crimson sequined gown, deep saturated red, the color of something between wine and fire. A dramatic cape fell from the shoulders, a clean, severe neckline, a thigh-high split that promised movement. A is the kind of garment that does not ask for attention. It simply makes attention inevitable. Vivian lifted it from the bag and held it up in the light. It was exactly as she remembered. More, somehow, now that she was looking at it with different eyes, with the eyes of a woman who had just listened, twice, to her husband's silence, where her name should have been, and had finally, cleanly, irrevocably, decided that she was done accommodating it. She hung the gown on the back of the door. She picked up her phone and called Dina Walsh. Dina answered on the second ring, the way she always did, as if she had been expecting it. "Tell me," Dina said. So Vivian told her. All of it. The recording. The silence. The gown. The invitation she had just remembered was still sitting unopened on the hall table. The Rourke Foundation Gala. At her name still printed as co-chair, a formality that had survived 12 years' excuse of her absence because apparently no one had thought to remove it. There was a pause on Dina's end. "The gala is in 3 weeks," Vivian said. "I know," Dina said. "I'm going to RSVP." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll clear my calendar," Dina said. "And Vivian? Don't tell Marco." Vivian looked at the crimson gown hanging against the white of the bedroom door, at the way it held light, at the way it seemed, even motionless, to take up exactly the right amount of space. "I wasn't planning to," she said. The 3 weeks between that phone call and the night of the gala were, from the outside, perfectly quiet. Vivian maintained her routines with the same unhurried consistency she always had. She tended the garden in the mornings. At the late-season air cold enough now to require a coat. She read in the afternoons. She prepared dinner for 2 on the evenings Marco came home, and for 1 on the evenings he didn't. And she made no particular distinction between the two in her manner or her expression. She asked Marco appropriate questions about his week when he was present, and did not ask questions about his absence when he wasn't. She was, by every visible measure, exactly the same woman she had been the week before. This was deliberate. And before we go any further, if you enjoy stories where the quiet wife becomes the most powerful person in the room, hit like and subscribe. What Vivian had understood in the long years of living adjacent to a man who operated in dangerous spaces was that the most powerful move in any situation was the one that went undetected until it was already complete. Marco had taught her this in his way, not through instruction but through observation. She had watched him for 12 years. She had paid attention. It turned out that attention, sustained and patient and never quite extinguished, was the most valuable thing she had quietly kept for herself throughout this marriage. She and Dina spoke every evening, not on Marco's network. Dina had arranged a separate line within the first 48 hours, a precaution that struck Vivian as perhaps excessive and then, upon reflection, as exactly right. Dina Walsh had not become one of the most effective attorneys in the city by underestimating the environments her clients were navigating. The financial documentation was more straightforward than Tara Shields, had she known about it, would have been comfortable with. Vivian had entered this marriage as a woman of independent means, a modest inheritance from her grandmother, a decade of curatorial earnings, and an investment account she had maintained quietly in her own name throughout the marriage, adding to it in small, unremarkable amounts that had never provoked scrutiny. It was not a fortune. It was, however, hers, entirely and demonstrably hers, and it meant that whatever happened after the gala, Vivian Rourke was not walking into it without a floor beneath her feet. Beyond the personal assets, Dina had spent 2 weeks constructing a precise account of Vivian's legitimate entitlements within the marital estate. 12 years, no separate income, a career suspended at the direct request of her husband for the explicit purpose of protecting his interests. The legal picture, Dina explained, was not complicated. It was actually rather clean, the kind of clean that tends to make opposing counsel uncomfortable. "You're not leaving empty-handed," Dina said on one of those evening calls. "Whatever you decide, whether you stay or whether you go, you're not leaving empty-handed." "I know," Vivian said. "Do you? Because I need you to actually know it, not just say it." Vivian looked out at the dark garden. "I know," she said again, and this time she meant it in the way Dina needed her to mean it, with the weight of someone who has fully accounted for her own position and found it, against all expectation, sound. While Vivian prepared in silence, Tara's shields expanded. There was no other word for it. In the weeks following the Laurel Club dinner, Tara's presence in Marco's public life grew in the way of something that has been given too much room and no resistance. She appeared at a property development presentation he hosted at the Meridian Club, stationed at his side in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental and too visible to be anything other than a declaration. She attended a private dinner for 12 at the home of one of Marco's senior business associates, introducing herself to the other guests with the fluid confidence of a woman who had decided her position was already secured and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. She had also, in these weeks, developed a particular habit in social conversation. She would allow Vivian's name to surface, as it occasionally did, because people were curious, and curiosity in certain circles tends to eventually voice itself. And she would handle it with a kind of elegant dismissal that was more effective than open contempt. She would pause, tilt her head slightly, offer a small, diplomatic smile, and then say something like, She's a very private person, always has been. Some people are simply more suited to quiet lives." Said with such evident compassion that the listener was left with the distinct impression that Vivian's absence from the world was a personal limitation rather than a circumstance imposed upon her. It was a masterful performance. Tara was genuinely skilled at this, at shaping narrative through the careful architecture of implication and tone. What she was less skilled at was reading rooms accurately when her own interests were at stake. She had identified Marco's vanity, his appetite for admiration, his taste for a certain kind of high society spectacle, and she had calibrated herself to all of it with impressive precision. What she had failed to adequately study was the other quality that had made Marco Rourke successful in spaces where miscalculation carried severe consequences: his instinct for when the ground was shifting beneath him. It was a subtle thing. Marco could not have named it in those weeks, if pressed. It was not a thought so much as a temperature, a slight, persistent coolness in the air of his own house that had not been there before. Vivian was the same. Her manner was unchanged. She asked him questions. But she moved through their shared space with her usual quiet competence. She did not confront him, did not withdraw, did not signal distress in any of the ways he might have recognized and known how to respond to. She was simply, imperceptibly, elsewhere, present in the room and absent in some more essential way that he could not locate or define. He dismissed it. He was a man who had learned to trust concrete intelligence over vague sensation, and there was no concrete intelligence here, nothing he could point to and name as a problem. So he set it aside. He turned his attention back to Tara, who was always warm, always available, always performing an enthusiasm for his company that was straightforward and uncomplicated and asked nothing of him except to be admired in return. Marco Rourke, for the first time in a long time, was making the mistake of confusing ease with safety. The official invitation to the Rourke Foundation Gala arrived at the house on a Thursday in an envelope of heavy cream stock embossed with the foundation's letterhead. This was not unusual. Vivian still received formal correspondence connected to the foundation because the administrative infrastructure had simply never been updated to remove her. What was listed on the inner card, beneath the date and venue and dress code, was her name: co-chair, Vivian Rourke. She set the envelope on the hall table and looked at it for a moment. Then she carried it to the kitchen, made tea, sat down, and read it in full. The gala was the kind of event the foundation held annually, a high society fundraiser that drew the city's legitimate elite, a portion of Marco's business world, housed several politicians, and the kind of press coverage that was careful and flattering and never looked too closely at anything. It was, by design, the most public event connected to the Rourke name. Vivian had co-chaired it in the early years of their marriage, with genuine investment. She had developed the program, selected the beneficiaries, written the opening remarks. Then, gradually, her involvement had been reduced to a name on an invitation, then to a name on a letterhead, then to nothing visible at all, while the gala continued without her, as though she had never been part of it. Her name was still on the card. She picked up her phone and sent a single reply to the foundation's events coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who had been managing foundation logistics for 8 years, and who responded within the hour with an email that contained, beneath its professional courtesy, what Vivienne recognized as genuine surprise. "Mrs. Rourke, we're so pleased you'll be joining us. I'll ensure your co-chair materials are prepared. Please let me know if there is anything you need ahead of the evening." Vivienne responded with a short list of what she would need: her speaking notes from the previous years for reference, the current program for review, and confirmation of the podium arrangement. She signed off, set her phone down, and finished her tea. She did not mention the RSVP to Marco. She did not mention it to anyone except Dana, who said only, "Good," and Raymond Osei, who called 2 days later. She had not contacted him, which meant Patricia had mentioned it to someone who had mentioned it to someone, as things in that world tended to move, and said in the particular warm baritone she had always associated with the Institute and her former life. "I heard. The gown is ready. Is there anything else you need?" "No," she said. "I think I have everything." "You always did," Raymond said. "You just forgot for a while." Tara found out about the RSVP on a Friday evening, 10 days before the gala, from a contact within the foundation's administrative circle. She received the information at a cocktail reception, mid-conversation, delivered by someone who assumed she already knew and was therefore startled by the way Tara's expression flickered, just once, just briefly, before resettling into its usual composed arrangement. She did not react in the room. She was too practiced for that. But that night, in Marco's apartment, she raised it. Calmly, she told herself. Strategically. She framed it not as concern, but as practical consideration. They were so close, she said, to a clean resolution. The gala was a significant public event. Vivienne's appearance there, in an official capacity, would create an impression that Marco might not want to encourage. It would be better, cleaner, more dignified for everyone involved, including Vivienne, if Marco reached out before the event and kindly suggested she allow her co-chair title to be formally transitioned. A respectful conversation. A quiet, mutual agreement. What she was asking for, beneath the careful language, was a public confirmation of her own position, before Vivienne could appear in a room and complicate the story Tara had been so carefully constructing. Marco listened. He was sitting in the chair near the window, one arm resting along the side, his expression giving nothing away, which was his default expression and therefore difficult to read even for someone who had been studying him for over a year. "I'll think about it," he said. Tara had expected this. She pressed, gently, with a smile, one hand on his arm. "I just think it would be better to handle it before the night, rather than—" "I said I'll think about it." The tone was not raised. It was simply final, in the particular way that Marco's voice became final when conversation had reached its boundary. Tara recognized it and withdrew gracefully, And because she was skilled at reading that specific signal, and turned the conversation toward something easier. But the hesitation stayed with her after she left. It was small, barely a pause, really, between her suggestion and his response. But Tara Shields had built her entire adult life on reading small signals in powerful men, and what she had read in that pause was something she did not have a comfortable name for. It was not indifference. It was not reluctance to cause Vivian pain. Marco was not, from what Tara had observed, a man significantly burdened by that particular consideration. It was something closer to uncertainty, the expression lasting less than a second of a man who has been presented with a move and found himself unsure, for the first time, of the board beneath it. Marco, for his part, sat at the window for a long time after Tara left. He thought about what she had asked. He thought about Vivian's name, still printed on the foundation materials after 12 years of her absence. He thought about the particular quality of the past 3 weeks, that undefinable coolness, that sense of a temperature he couldn't locate. He thought about calling Vivian. He picked up his phone twice and set it down both times because he was a man who did not make calls until he understood exactly what he was calling about, and he did not yet understand this. He told himself he would handle it after the weekend. He told himself there was time. He was wrong about the time, but he would not discover that until the doors of the Harrington Grand opened on a Friday night 3 weeks after Vivian Rourke had pressed play on a voice recording, had listened to his silence, and decided, quietly, completely, and without a single word to anyone who might have warned him, that she was done being invisible. The night arrived the way significant nights always do, identically to every other night, right up until the moment it didn't. Vivian dressed alone, which was how she had planned it. Dana had offered to come, had in fact insisted twice, and Vivian had declined both times with the same quiet firmness she had been practicing for 3 weeks. This part, the getting ready, the standing in front of the mirror, the becoming, this part belonged to her alone. No audience, no encouragement required. She had spent 12 years becoming invisible with no witnesses. She would reverse it the same way. She showered. She dried her hair until it fell straight and sharp to her shoulders, eye precise as a blade. She did her makeup with the unhurried focus of someone returning to a skill they had never actually lost, only set down. The particular deep-water blue of her eyes, made more so by careful liner. Her mouth, a shade that stopped just short of the gown's crimson, so as not to compete with it. She put in the diamond drops Raymond had couriered to the house that morning, without a note this time. No note was necessary. Everything had already been said. Then she lifted the gown from the back of the door where it had been hanging for 3 weeks, stepped into it, and zipped it herself. She stood in front of the full-length mirror for exactly 1 moment. She looked like herself. For the first time in a very long time, she looked entirely, completely like herself, and the recognition of that fact was so sudden and so clean that she had to breathe through it carefully before she could pick up her bag, walk down the stairs, and step into the car that was waiting outside. She did not look back at the house. The Harrington Grand was already full when she arrived. This was intentional. She had timed it precisely, neither so early that her entrance would land in an empty room, nor so late that the evening's rhythms had already settled, and people had stopped paying attention to the doors. She had spent 12 years adjacent to a man who understood the architecture of entrances. She had paid attention. The car stopped. The door opened. She stepped out onto the red-carpeted entrance and walked toward the grand doors of the ballroom, without pausing, without adjusting anything, without performing the particular self-consciousness of someone who is aware of being looked at. She was aware. She simply did not require it to be comfortable. The doors opened. The sound reached her before the sight. The specific frequency of a crowded, formal room. The layered register of 200 conversations. And a live quartet. And the percussion of crystal and silverware. Then the room itself, blazing with chandelier light, gold-walled, magnificent, full of the city's most carefully assembled people in their most carefully assembled clothing. And then, within 3 seconds of her crossing the threshold, the sound changed. It did not stop. It never fully stops in a room like that. The social machinery is too practiced. But it shifted. Conversations dropped half a register, heads turned. At the particular alertness of a room that has just noticed something passed through the assembled guests like a current through water, invisible and immediate and felt by everyone simultaneously. Vivian walked. The crimson gown moved with her, sequins scattering chandelier light across the walls and ceiling as she crossed the room, red sparks traveling ahead of her like advance notice. The cape swept behind her shoulders with each step. Her dark hair, her still face, her eyes that moved across the room with the calm assessment of someone who has arrived precisely where they intended and finds it exactly as expected. She did not look for Marco. She did not look for Tara. She walked to the podium. Patricia, the Foundation's events coordinator, Joe was standing near the platform with the organized anxiety of someone who has been managing a significant logistical uncertainty for 10 days. When she saw Vivian approaching, her expression moved rapidly through surprise, relief, and something approaching awe before settling on professional composure. She stepped forward with the folder of speaking notes, pressed it into Vivian's hands, and said, in a low and somewhat fervent voice, "The room is yours, Mrs. Rourke." Vivian thanked her, stepped to the microphone, set the folder on the podium and did not open it. She knew what she wanted to say. She had always known. She had simply not been given a room to say it in. "Good evening," she said. And her voice through the sound system was clear and warm and carried the particular authority of someone who is completely unafraid of silence, who will wait for it rather than fill it unnecessarily. The remaining conversations in the room finished themselves and stopped. 200 people looked at the podium. She spoke for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. She spoke about the Foundation's literacy programs, the 3 community centers currently funded, the 1,200 children enrolled in after-school reading programs, the adult education initiative that had placed 47 women into employment in the past year alone. She spoke about what it meant to give someone language, to give them the tools to name their own experience, to advocate for themselves, to build a life from the inside out rather than waiting for someone else to build it for them. She spoke about what it meant to be seen. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. The room was so completely, utterly hers that raising her voice would have been redundant, the way a lighthouse doesn't shout. When she finished, the applause was immediate and genuine, not the polite, practiced applause of people performing appreciation, but the real kind, slightly louder than anyone intended, carrying the slight surprise of an audience that has just received more than they anticipated. Vivian stepped back from the podium, handed the folder back to Patricia with a word of thanks, accepted a glass of water from a passing server. Then, and only then, she looked across the room. Marco was standing 40 feet away, near the far wall, and he looked like a man who had just watched something he did not have a category for. The expression on his face, she had studied that face for 18 years, learned every variation of its guarded surfaces, was something she had almost never seen on it. Not guilt, not quite yet, something prior to guilt. The expression of a man who has been suddenly and completely shown something he has been successfully not seeing for a very long time. and finds the sight of it more significant than he was prepared for. Tara was beside him. Silver gown, champagne, her hand on his arm. But the hand on his arm had a different quality now than it had an hour ago. It was holding on rather than resting there. A small but legible difference. Vivian crossed the room toward Marco with the same unhurried pace she had used to enter it. People stepped aside without quite meaning to. She was aware of eyes following her progress and paid them no particular attention. She stopped in front of Marco. She looked at him directly, without performance, without the assembled armor of anger or the softness of appeal. Simply looked at him, the way you look at someone you have known completely and are now seeing clearly for the first time in the same moment. She opened her bag and withdrew an envelope, cream stock, sealed. "From Dina," she said, "and from me." Marco took it. He looked at it, then back at her. "There's a letter inside," Vivian said. "Read it when you have a moment." She held his gaze for 3 seconds more, enough to make certain he understood that this was not a performance, not a bid for sympathy, not an escalation designed to cause a scene. It was a reckoning, cut delivered quietly, which was the only way she had ever known how to deliver anything important. Then she turned to move away. Tara's voice arrived before she had taken 2 steps. "You should have stayed home." It was pitched low, the way Tara pitched everything, controlled, designed to land precisely and carry no further than intended. But the room had been quiet in their vicinity, the way rooms go quiet around an event they sense is significant, and it carried. Vivian stopped. She turned back. She looked at Tara Shields. The silver gown, the careful face, the hand still gripping Marco's arm. And she took the full measure of her without hurry and without heat. The look of a woman who has examined a situation completely and found it, in the end, smaller than the space it had occupied in her life. "I am home, sweetheart," she said. "Oh, you're the guest." She said it quietly. She did not need volume. The words were clear to everyone within 15 feet, which was everyone who mattered in that moment, and the silence that followed them was the particular silence of a room that has just witnessed something it will be discussing for a considerable time. Then Vivian Rourke walked away. Not out of the room, but into it, toward Patricia and the Foundation representatives, and the board members who had been waiting for 12 years to meet the woman behind the name on their letterhead. Marco dismissed Tara from the gala 40 minutes later. There was no dramatic scene. There was a brief, low conversation near the East Corridor, and then Tara was in a car. And then she was gone. He had not done it out of theater. He was not a man who made decisions as performances. And he had done it because he had stood in that ballroom and watched the woman he had spent 12 years making invisible command every significant person in that room, the politicians, the investors, the journalists, the foundation board, with a grace and an authority that was entirely her own, that he had not given her and could not take from her, and the understanding of what he had spent 12 years suppressing had arrived in his chest like a door opening onto something vast and cold and completely of his own construction. He had made her disappear. He had told himself it was protection. He had told himself it was love. Standing in that room, watching her speak, I said he understood that it had also been something he had never let himself name. The particular selfishness of a powerful man who had wanted to keep the most remarkable thing in his life entirely to himself, who had mistaken possession for protection, and called the result a marriage. Tara, for her part, discovered in the weeks that followed the gala what Vivian could have told her much earlier, that the social architecture she had built around herself was not hers. It was borrowed. Every introduction, every invitation, every open door had been a function of her proximity to Marco Rourke's name. Without the name, The doors closed with remarkable speed and remarkably little ceremony. The people who had laughed at her dinner table stories stopped returning her calls. The invitations stopped arriving. And the world she had performed herself into simply reclassified her and moved on, the way that world always does, without sentiment or explanation. She was not destitute. She was simply ordinary, which, for a woman who had organized her entire identity around being extraordinary in rooms that belonged to other people, was its own species of devastation. Vivian did not return to the house. She moved, 3 days after the gala, into a townhouse in the Caldwell district, a narrow, light-filled building with a garden in the back that needed attention, and high ceilings that held the afternoon light until early evening. Dana had identified it. Vivian had seen it once and said yes immediately, the way you say yes to something that feels less like a new beginning and more like a return. Had she called Raymond O'Say the first week and told him she was ready to come back to curatorial work. He told her he had been holding a project for her for 2 years, waiting, because no one else he knew would do it right. She started the following Monday. The work of rebuilding was not dramatic. It was early mornings and correspondence and the gradual, satisfying reassembly of a professional self that had never actually disappeared, only been set down, in a wardrobe, in a garment bag, waiting. Her name began appearing again in the circles where it had once been known. People remembered her. New people encountered her and were surprised to learn she had ever been absent. Marco, meanwhile, did what the letter had asked, not because he was told to, but because he had read it twice in the car on the way home from the gala. I'm sitting in the dark with the envelope in his hands, and by the time he finished the second reading, he understood that Vivian had offered him something remarkable. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of earning it. From a woman who owed him nothing, who had already quietly ensured she needed nothing from him, who was offering him a choice purely because she had once loved him enough to believe he was capable of making it correctly. He showed up to the first meeting with Dina present, as required. He showed up to the second, and the third. He began, carefully, and with evident discomfort, the process of dismantling habits of secrecy and control that had calcified over decades. He acknowledged Vivian publicly, in a foundation statement, and in a conversation with a journalist who had been asking questions about his personal life for years, in the small daily architecture of a man choosing transparency over management. It was not easy for him. She did not require it to be easy. She required it to be real. 6 months after the night of the red gown, Marco called and asked if she would have dinner with him. Not at a restaurant, somewhere private, somewhere that wasn't a performance. She said yes, because she had been watching the consistency of his efforts with the same careful attention she had always given to things that mattered. And what she had seen was not a man performing change, but a man quietly, stubbornly, enacting it. They ate at a small table by the window of a restaurant she had chosen in the neighborhood where she now lived. That it was an ordinary evening in every visible respect. They talked, really talked, the way they had in the early years, when conversation had felt like discovery rather than navigation. She had forgotten, or perhaps had allowed herself to forget, how well they understood each other when the space between them was honest. Near the end of the evening, Marco set something on the table between them. A ring. Not the original. Something new, simple, exact. Chosen with the particular care of a man who understands that this gesture carries the full weight of everything that preceded it and cannot afford to be careless. He looked at her. I want to build something with you, he said, where you're not hidden, where you're beside me, not behind me, beside me. He did not elaborate. He did not perform certainty or press for an answer. How he set the ring on the table and he waited, because he had learned, finally, and at considerable cost, that this was how you loved Vivian Rourke. Not by deciding for her, but by making the space and letting her choose. She looked at the ring for a long moment, long enough that the table candle moved in some imperceptible current of air, and the light shifted. Then she picked it up. Not because he had asked, not because she needed him or needed his name or needed the protection of his world. She had demonstrated to herself and to everyone who had been watching that she needed none of those things. She picked it up because she chose to. Because love, when it is honest and chosen freely and stripped of the architecture of control, is still one of the more extraordinary things available to a person. Thus, because the man sitting across from her had done the harder thing, had looked at himself clearly, and found the work of changing worth doing. And she respected that in the deep, specific way that only someone who has done the same kind of work can fully recognize. She slid the ring onto her finger. She looked at him. "Beside you," she said. "Not behind." "Beside," he agreed. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Friday evening, indifferent and luminous. Inside, two people began, carefully and with full knowledge of the cost of carelessness, to build something new from the materials of something that had nearly been lost. The woman who had been called invisible had walked into a room and owned it, and the mistress who had crowned herself the most beautiful woman in every room she entered had learned what Vivian Rourke had quietly known for years, that beauty performed for an audience is a costume, and costumes eventually come off. But a woman who knows her own worth, who carries it not in the cut of a gown or the approval of a powerful man, but in the bone-deep certainty of her own value, she doesn't need a room to confirm it. She simply walks in, and the room understands. And if that moment gave you chills, take 1 second and hit like. Subscribe for more stories where the woman they underestimated turns out to be the most powerful person in the room, and share this story with someone who needs the reminder. Never mistake a quiet woman for a weak one.